Now, the economic situation in Zimbabwe is worsening. Ordinary citizens are struggling to keep up with inflation, which has reached triple-digit figures. There have been calls for sanctions against the country to be lifted. At a tribute to the late former Zimbabwean president, Robert Mugabe, President Mnangagwa urged the West to remove what he called illegal sanctions.
We stand emboldened by the recent declaration by SADC, setting aside the 25th of October as a day to call for the unconditional removal of the illegal sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe. May the world honor the late comrade Mugabe by ensuring that sanctions encumbering Zimbabwe are immediately removed.
So the question is, are these sanctions what are responsible for the situation in Zimbabwe? And if those sanctions are lifted, will things get better? Well, joining me now in studio is Antony Sguazzin, who's a senior reporter for Africa Bloomberg. Thanks so much for joining us. Now, you're a man who's been watching the Zimbabwe situation for years. You've lived there and understand the economic situation on the ground. So President Mnangagwa says, lift these illegal sanctions. Let's begin by trying to unpack what are these sanctions they are, because depending on who you talk to, we've heard somebody this week saying that it's a war against Zimbabwe. What's your take? What are these sanctions?
Okay, well, the sanctions are supposedly targeted. They're on a range of politicians and other individuals who the EU and the US feel have been responsible for alleged misdeeds in Zimbabwe. And in addition to that, certain government-linked companies are also sanctioned. So you could argue that because they're sanctioned, they won't affect the economy very much. Now, that is true to a certain extent, but my understanding is that if you want to do business with Zimbabwe, especially if you're linked to the US or you have business in the US, every single deal has to be vetted. It's a very bureaucratic process, and as a result, a lot of business doesn't take place. So for sure, it has had an effect. I wouldn't say it's the driving reason for the decline of the economy, but no doubt it's a negative.
All right. So what you're saying is that it's a bureaucratic hurdle more than it is about forbidding and stopping trade completely.
Definitely. I think it's an inhibition to trade. And companies struggle or they are reluctant to trade with Zimbabwe because of the sanctions on certain individuals. So it's not blanket sanctions. Business is done there by American and European companies, but I think it deters a lot of them.
All right, so if we take sanctions out of the equation and say, what other contributors have gotten us to where we are now? So Zimbabwe was, 1980, the Zim dollar was stronger than the Rand. What has gone wrong over time?
Well, if you speak to people there, economists, even politicians, even the current administration, no doubt the economy has been very badly managed. I think, first of all, we had the farm invasions in 2000. Now you can argue whether those were justified or not, but the way they were implemented definitely disrupted the economy, sapped exports, and put the economy in a very bad place. Now, what the Zimbabwean authorities and the former central bank did was to print money. That triggered inflation and destroyed people's savings and basically put the economy in a very bad way. As we know, in 2009, after a bout of probably record hyperinflation, figures of anything between 500 billion% and above, that was abandoned, and the Zimbabwe dollar was put into history, and we started using the dollar and other currencies, but mainly the US dollar. Now that did stabilize things, and for a while things improved, but it's very hard when you don't have your own currency because you don't manage your own financial affairs. And after 4 or 5 years, especially when we see the Rand depreciating, the Kwacha in Zambia depreciating, Zimbabwean manufacturing became very, very expensive. So importers did very well, people lost their jobs, and the economy got locked in this vicious circle where it kept on a downward spiral. Now, what the authorities have tried to do since then is, first of all, introduce a quasi-currency, and that has been used more and more. As recently as February, it was pegged at parity to the dollar. On the black market, it was nothing like parity, but no doubt it kept a certain amount of stability. Now, because there was a shortage of dollars, of hard currency in the country, that was allowed to weaken. Now, in the last few weeks, we've seen that really take off since the Zimbabwe dollar proper was reintroduced in June. And the last I looked, we were looking at 15-1 on the official rates, as much as 23 on the black market rate.
So that's weaker than the rand now, the RTGS.
Incredibly so. And one must remember that people are not paid very much in Zimbabwe. I did a calculation yesterday, and a lowly paid civil servant will be making $39 a month.
Wow.
And when you think Zimbabwe has higher costs, when you go to a supermarket, it's hard to tell, 20 to 40% more expensive than South Africa. That really doesn't go very far.
So what needs to be done? Sanctions to me doesn't sound like that's actually the solution. There's got to be a lot more done beyond sanctions.
Sure. I think sanctions is a bit of a distraction. When we speak to analysts, sure, it does have an effect. It's a useful excuse for the government. I mean, obviously, it's trying to do its best to right the economy, but it's in a very difficult situation. It's taken a lot of missteps, and it's blamed by the populace for that. So it's quite useful to hold up sanctions. A lot of things need to happen, but Zimbabwe is in a very deep hole. It's, I think, $9 billion in debt. It's in arrears to multilateral institutions. And until it meets those arrears, it cannot get any debt forgiveness. Now, what we've been told is that they've taken all the economic pain that they've been advised to take, and that's been very hard on the ordinary Zimbabwean. But at the same time, they've dragged their feet on democratic reforms. And that means that we won't be seeing any debt forgiveness anytime soon, which means that the country is locked in a downward spiral. And we've seen that recently. There's no fuel. They've been unfortunate in that there's been a bad drought. We know a cyclone Idai wiped out crops on the eastern side of the country. But for the first time, we're seeing hunger in the cities, and I think that's an indictment of the economic policies. It really is a pretty bad situation. And
the manufacturing sector used to be such an important sector, but with load shedding of 18 hours a day, that's manufacturing down completely, really.
Completely. I was in Harare about 4 or 5 weeks ago. I walked through a supermarket. The only thing I saw made locally was a couple of packets of biscuits.
Wow.
The rest is imported from South Africa, and it's not cheap. It's way more expensive than here.
So people will ask again. You've got Zambia to the north, very similar economies in many ways. What is it that they got right? Because at 1980, Zimbabwe would look north and laugh actually at what the Kwacha was doing at the time. What is it that Zambia has managed to get right over time that Zimbabwe perhaps can learn from?
I don't know if that's the right way to phrase it. Zambia hasn't done well. I think Zimbabwe has just done a lot worse. So Zimbabwe came from a much higher point, so to speak. I do recall that, it was always a more advanced economy. Cell phones were in Zimbabwe earlier. Connectivity was good. Now all of that's gone away. Now Zambia has modernized to a certain extent, but it has its own debt problems. What it hasn't done is just rampantly print money, and that's what happened in the early 2000s. I don't believe it's happening at the moment. That's not what we're hearing, and the current administration, current finance minister have said very firmly that they will not be increasing money supply. But they've got themselves into a situation where they probably do need external help. That's what most analysts say. And it's very hard to convince people to throw several $1 billion to Zimbabwe.
Is corruption still a problem in Zimbabwe? Because that was another one of the contributors to the demise.
Well, I think it's still pretty low on various corruption indices. What is interesting is that there have been a few government officials arrested recently, and I presume that's with the blessing of the authorities. This freezing of the accounts of an oil company called Secunda last week, which is closely linked to government, is very interesting. And they have been blamed explicitly by the president this weekend for weakening the currency. Now, I'm not sure the mechanics of how that works, but most of the foreign currency has been going to pay for fuel imports, wheat, and a few other things. So the fact they're taking action against these organizations is very interesting, and it does show that they're in a dire situation and they are trying to fix the situation. Whether they're taking the right actions is hard to tell.
And I suppose the diaspora continues to be a very valuable contributor to the flow of currency into the country. take that out of the equation and it could have been 10 times worse.
Absolutely. I mean, I saw figures recently that 30% of Zimbabwe's foreign exchange comes from the diaspora. As we both know, we're both part of the diaspora. There are many millions of Zimbabweans around the world, South Africa, the UK, all the neighboring countries of Zimbabwe who send money home. Now, if there wasn't a large diaspora, there'd be very little money going back to Zimbabwe. Because at the moment, their exports are very minor. Yes, there's been lots of talk about developing the mining industry. Lots of deals have been signed. But there's not much progress on the ground. And also, a mine takes 5 to 10 years to build. You can't fix an economy overnight.
All right, I want to come back to where we started, because this story keeps coming up. Sanctions. If you can, I don't know, apportion a percentage to Zimbabwe's problems, what percentage would you attribute that to sanctions?
I think that would be very hard. I think that if you ask most people, they would say it's an intangible thing. It's a deterrent, but how do you work out how many businesses have not invested in Zimbabwe because of sanctions? What I would say is that no doubt having a country sanctioned gives it a bad reputation, and it would discourage certain companies. And bureaucracy is never a good thing for investment. So they could be lifted. I know that a lot of countries, SADC has called for lifting. I think even the MDC, the main opposition group, has not been that averse to lifting some of the sanctions. But in reality, it's not going to fix the economy overnight.
All right, lots of hard work still be done.
Definitely.
And who would want to be a finance minister in any country, but for Zimbabwe, it's doubly difficult. Antony, thanks so much indeed for joining us and sharing your insights with us. Okay, so that's Bloomberg senior Africa writer talking to us about the situation in Zimbabwe, and we'll continue to monitor the progress and the hard work that they're trying to do to turn things around in that country.